It's an incredibly significant moment, and you're seeing a lot of conversations happening around this oil shock, this crisis, because people are trying to understand, as we did with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or COVID hitting, all of the stuff that makes up the economy and what happens when that gets destabilized, basically. And so, like, a lot of eyes are focused on this one narrow passage. And you've actually been to the Strait, which is this, relatively narrow strategic choke point that runs between Oman and Iran, and represents the main maritime link between the Persian Gulf and basically the rest of the world. So now, you've got this war of aggression that officials said wasn't going to escalate, and that is escalating out of control. And yeah, like, one of the things that you wrote in 2021 in your book, Climate and Capital in the Age of Petroleum, is that energy, maritime trade, and the concerns of climate converge in these choke points with the circulation of energy and commodities. And then in a more recent piece of writing, you and a co-author talk about how when these infrastructures fail or are made to fail, whether it's through accidents or acts of sabotage, the reverberations are often and the disappearance of value is often swift, enormous, and incalculable. So, all of this feels strangely prophetic of this moment, where, like, the International Energy Agency is, like, advising countries to change laws around transportation and all this stuff. Does it feel to you like we're back in the 1970s, which was the subject of that first book, or are we in totally different times when it comes to the shock and the ripple effects? Like, what's going on right now from your perspective?
There's an enormous amount of discourse and attention on this particular logistical space at the moment. And, it's both like it's really profound. It's deeply troubling. It's enraging, but it's also like curious to see like the New York Times and like Stephen Colbert, like talk about this particular part of the economy and to admit it. So let's say without very much complication in the analytic that they marshal to do so, admit quite openly, that this is we live in a petrocultural world, and that these kinds of spaces, these hidden abodes of circulation, as it were, are kind of the secret of how power, value converge in really material ways. And it is like a little bit strange to just like pick up any newspaper or look at any kind of news podcast and see everybody really fixated on this one particular choke point. And I think as a metonym for this larger realization that maybe at the tail end of a long cycle of accumulation, which maybe is not part of how they would phrase it, but I would, really, that begins in the 1970s, the tail end of a cycle of accumulation, uh, the terms by which the conclusion to that cycle of accumulation are negotiated, and the medium in which some other emergent form of negotiating the movement of matter and value will be written in the medium of these logistical spaces, invariably. I stood just around the corner from the Strait of Hormuz in a place called Fujairah, which is in the United Arab Emirates, and I was there 2019 with two friends and colleagues, both of whom I believe at some point maybe you have had on the show, Bram McDonald and Amanda Butskis, good friends of mine and mentors. And we were there for an academic reason, but we decided to take a trip to Fujairah, which we knew already, sort of from our own research and conversations, was the second largest bulk diesel terminal in the world. And why that is important is because it means that the lion's share of ocean-borne cargo, tankers, and so on, at some point on their journey, stop at this one particular, let's say, non-place called Fujairah, and so as a point of sensitivity, as a choke point, as a kind of as a point on a map of a cartography of capital that is otherwise designed to avoid, circumvent these kinds of risks or contestations. We sort of, you could just see, on the map, that this is actually like a very easy place to contest, and that at any point geopolitical conflict at the scale that we're now seeing would centralize this particular region. I can say more about what it's sort of like physically, because I actually think that's one of the strange things that's like entirely gone missing from the hot takes, let's say, of the contemporary conflict, the imperialist aggression against Iran on the part of Israel and the US. But as an ecology, it is also like quite interesting and tells its own kind of story, but also I would say as a space of labor. So Fujairah is a space of almost entirely Southeast Asian laborers. Mostly they're on part-time temporary contracts with very, very few rights. And that is the context of this, I would say, geography is a lot of, basically indentured labor. And this entire logistical space is really lubricated on the extraction of labor from these kinds of bodies, and that is not part of the contemporary conversation. I find that very strange. I do think that we're seeing the conclusion to a cycle of accumulation that we could maybe so broadly call, neoliberalism, or perhaps maybe more technically the 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 death pangs of secular stagnation, the long downturn, which really began in the 1970s as well. And, that is a sort of macroeconomic description adopted by a number of theorists, most of whom have some kind of Marxist framework, but not all of them, certainly, to describe the falling rates of productivity that follow from the 1970s reorganization of the economy, which, of course, is sort of centrally about also how the production of what formerly was very cheap and accessible oil had then in the 70s become quite expensive, logistically difficult, and financially heavy as a endeavor. And the financialization of that sector is related to the falling rates of profit, but is not itself the same. But like the ways that they interact in complicated ways, produces a sort of long downturn of the 1970s through to really 2008. We've seen a number of like political phenomena and very surprising cultural shifts, and certainly economic conflicts and crises that I think are really about like living in the wake of that cycle of accumulation, which has never really been sort of cracked open and redefined for a future. And so instead we have just like a kind of, horrifying slate of nostalgic, populist, fascist power grabs, which have more or less been successful. And I think that's actually, at the heart really of what's going on here in the Strait of Hormuz, and this sort of like really, really unprecedented and absolutely homicidal and dangerous, though I would say not entirely unhinged, aggression against Iran. And by that, I do not mean I defend at all the aggression, but maybe we'll get to this later. I think, one of the things I'm noticing, I'm sure you are too, in a lot of these sort of editorial accounts of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, especially by the sort of liberal media, will almost always seek to explain what is otherwise quite inexplicable behavior, at least if you are if you are trying to explain, the behavior and the decisions of the Department of War and Trump, based on an understanding of what motivates these people economically. It does seem quite inexplicable, the decision to to attack and presumably anticipate the economic fallout from such a thing. And yet, so, the liberal media will say, well, they're just unhinged. They never anticipated this. They have no strategy. I want to say that is a deeply and troublingly comforting narrative that I think the liberal press tells itself, that these behaviors are inexplicable, that they're the result of unhinged, unthoughtful people, and that actually there isn't a kind of very coherent strategy that might not align at all with their worldview, and that might also be why it's so troubling. But I don't think politically it's viable to imagine that this is sort of accidental and sort of that the consequences of this were not calculated. I actually think that's a disempowering narrative to tell ourselves. I think instead, unfortunately, we should be trying to understand whose interests are being met here. It's quite clear that most working population in the West voting types will not benefit, then in fact it will be at their expense. That's clear from rising gas prices, from the rising cost of food, and so on. But there are people who are benefiting from this. There are interests being met, and maybe we'll get to that. But I think it's a mistake to say that this is sort of like unplanned and spontaneous and unhinged.
That's super interesting. I was watching the Ones and Twos podcast, right? Adam Tooze, this economist and writer.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, really smart. He did make the argument that it's a bad idea basically to sane wash this inexplicable move. That there is something utterly unstrategic, at least from certain worldviews, certain points of view, about this intervention, this war of aggression on Iran. But I think you're right to say it's also fallacious and simplistic to fall almost for like the pop culture fantasy of, these are just people that want to watch the world burn or something, like that they're just unhinged. There are absolutely interests being served. And this is part of a continuum, right? This continuum of, petrostates warring with other petrostates, the United States intervening to secure fossil resources. There's a lot of, yeah, there's a pattern here. But yeah, there was a lot in what you said. I want to kind of talk about that question of price, I guess, as a signal, because you're right that this is maybe the termination of a thing that begins in the 1970s, the cycle of accumulation. And that termination, the end of easy oil, as it's sometimes been called, is being felt largely through market pressures that, in the affluent global north, the assumption is will not affect demand. That with, rising prices, you're not necessarily going to see a decline in demand of the type that we perhaps saw a little bit in the context of COVID. People are still going to pay whatever is the assumption for this energy, this fossil energy. And one of the crisis measures being taken, and this started after 1973, is the use of these strategic petroleum reserves, right? So the US creates it in 73. It contains something like 700 million barrels of oil. The IEA has its own emergency reserves spread out across 32 member states that amount to a 1.2 billion barrels of oil. China has its own, apparently, 1.2 billion barrels of reserve oil. That to me is just staggering to think about, right? That amount of oil sitting in reserve, waiting to be dispersed in the context of these crises that happen, as you say, in easy to contest conflict zones, right? I wanted to ask about this maybe in relationship to the things that you write about in the supply chain essay, because it does offer this sort of language for getting to the bottom of what's important about those reserves. You say the flux of movement and interruption, of absence and presence, of release and supply, of expansion and contraction, of stoppage and flow really does kind of underwrite or undergird this whole fossil economy, that it is like largely about, circulation. That's how money is made. And when it stops, when you have these choke points that actually, slam shut, there's this panic that sets in, and then these instruments start to move, start to operate. Do you think this release of, an unprecedented amount of oil in the context of this particular crisis, 400 million barrels, the IEA has released, can that keep energy prices down? And what does it reveal, this move, about sort of the flux of movement, interruption, stoppage, and flow?
So the first thing I think that's worth maybe thinking about together with regards to the quantity of these reserves and the historical moment that they became a necessary political strategy is that really, of course, and you're sort of suggesting this, they have been since the 70s a mechanism to temper volatility, to temper price volatility, right? And I think that's because, as most of us sort of know in a colloquial way now, like most oil has been traded on futures markets since the late 70s, early 80s. Really, late or the early 80s becomes the sort of dominant mode by which the contract to deliver X amount of oil is negotiated and assured. And those futures markets are themselves kind of, they're in ways to modulate volatility around supply, and also the just sort of enormous amount of friction that exists within it, that this particular supply chain, like labor friction, ecological friction, just the unpredictability of sort of seaborne trade, and all of the different kinds of national regulations that are still not really standardized in the late 70s, early 80s. That means sort of the movement of a barrel as an object, right? As a kind of metaphor. Brian Jacobson has this amazing essay about the use of the metaphor of the oil barrel that sort of rises in the 80s, as a metric of this price. But if you imagine a barrel actually moving through the supply chain, right, it has to circumvent and move through so many sort of sites of friction, that the futures market is a way to sort of temper some of that, so that you can essentially have more standardized national accounts, you can have more predictable rates of growth. And especially when in the 70s and 80s, virtually every economy is like entirely wedded to the affordances of the energetic affordances of oil, or the financial affordances of oil. I think that's the second part, right? Is like it. So I think most economists would say, the sweet spot for the price of internationally traded oil is around 70 to $90 a barrel. 90 is already getting a little bit high, but it's still relatively affordable. Once we get closer to 100 or 150, then there's still a lot of money being made, but it starts to act as a negative. Its elasticity over the other kinds of metrics of the economy begin to snap back and becomes a constraint on the capacity of other parts of the economy to produce what they do, either financially or energetically, through the affordances of oil. And so I think, we have, by most estimates, although the Chinese reserve, that's mostly speculative, but I am also hearing over 1 billion. I'm hearing actually much, much more than the IEA. But based on most estimates at the moment, it seems as though the plan basically is to create this buffer between 100 and 150 for the next 6 months, because that's what the current contracts are being negotiated at. That's the timeline of the current contracts, right? And so you won't, hopefully, I mean, except for, like, obviously, airlines are going to jack their prices the second they get a chance to. But I think in general, the macroeconomic consequences of this surge are probably not going to be felt immediately in the next 6 months. And I think that, because we have so much oil to let into the economy to temper that surge, if we get to a point in 6 months when this is largely unresolved, if Iran is still exclusively permitting access to its own trading partners, then we'll see I think we'll see a geopolitical strategy emerge that is clearly about delaying that crisis point, right? Because I think at that point the reserves will run too low for futures markets to responsibly, agree to a sub 150 a barrel, knowing that it's largely running out. And I don't, but then I think this is where it gets really complicated and fascinating, right? It's like the price of the barrel of oil is not just the price of a barrel of oil; it's the price of everything else too. Our pension funds, the amount, the cost to transfer literally any commodity using petrochemical fuels, fertilizers, the cost of food, the price of food, price of labor. I mean, as a force over the other metrics we use to kind of account for this relative health or character of the economy, the price of oil is uniquely impactful over all others. That relationship between the price of oil in American dollars and then the larger metrics we point to have, to sort of get a picture of the shape of the economy is largely indexed to the fact that oil is traded was traded universally in American dollars. And that is an outcome of the 1970s as well, right? I, I think as of we're recording this on March 22nd, so things are changing literally every hour. But last I checked yesterday, um, the 8 trading partners who have access to Iranian oil are trading not in American dollars for the first time since the 1970s. They're trading in the yuan. And I think that is partial in my, I'm really trying not to offer hot takes, but my hot take why Trump last night in a, whatever the fuck he calls it, not a tweet, whatever his idiotic fascist platform is called, Truth Social. His like on his tweet in the middle of the night, that this basically, in all caps, that Iran has got to end this embargo on international trade through the Strait of Hormuz, or else all hell will break loose. It feels as though that's like the result of this announcement that actually there's no problem with the trading of Iranian oil, and it will not be traded in American dollars, and that ends basically a 50-year monopoly that the Americans have on the monetary constraints over the trading of oil. And I think that's a big change. That's why I say I think we might be seeing the emergence of like a new, of course, multipolar oil world in addition to a political world.
Yeah, and that's also so hard to wrap your head around, just the nature of money. It's like you need to have a degree in Marxism to like get down to the bottom
If
of like
only, if
the
only we could offer those.
you know what I mean? Like the virtuality of money and how it, regulates social relations. I know that like you've written in interesting ways about like how this approach to talking about these things that is all about like expose, about just like making visible the invisible, is somewhat like superficial. And I think I agree that like just leaving it there is not as worthwhile in some ways as sort of trying to get to what you were just trying to get to, which is the sort of exploitative and asymmetrical relations of power that capitalism largely like seeks to reinforce. And so that challenge is a real one, and one that I like to take on in some ways by still like trying to historicize it, I guess. And like, the article you've written talks about like the emergence at a certain point of these new professions that are designed to help expand maritime infrastructures and these labor markets, the so-called revolution in logistics. That has totally ramped up and transformed global trade in like huge orders of magnitude, right? Leading to just more and more and more commodities being shipped across the globe. But also, you say laws have had to be developed to facilitate this scale of just ports and throughput. And like one of the frameworks that I'm seeing emerge, like alongside this kind of shift in monetary policy, I guess, is just the like incredible importance of insurance in this market, in the market. Halima Croft, the global head of commodity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, told NPR that, quote, insurers and shipping companies have decided that it's unsafe to traverse the Strait of Hormuz. And so this is really an insurance-driven shutdown. This seems to have caught the White House, she says, off guard. Can you explain sort of the rise of these professions that facilitate global trade, and how things like, because apparently the first Trump administration created its own development finance corporation, the DFC, which was designed to provide political risk insurance in situations like this. Analogous, it feels like to me in terms of climate, to the state of California offering its own insurance to make sure homes can still be developed when they can't be insured in wildfire zones. Like, what's happening to just kind of keep the lifeboat afloat in terms of creating these new organizations that, are about still, I feel like, managing volatility?
That's a really good question. I'm not an expert in this field by any means, but it's super interesting to think about how this is like become such an important factor in altering the kind of like the strategy of the White House as well, right? As you say, once the insurance backing was dropped, for good reason. Iran said we'll bomb those boats. Suddenly, the White House became much more active and sort of took this crisis as a serious crisis. And I think it's because, again, it seems to me like there's a number of examples within the American context where you have a kind of dual power structure, a dual power um, maybe crisis. And I think you have traditionally the sort of Wall Street type insurance brokerage firms who are there on site to negotiate and secure the trade of various kinds of commodities through supply chains that are, mostly in their minds virtual, but of course actually are riddled with supply risks. And those insurance companies have had a pretty stable relationship to the transfer of value in various supply chains that are much more like dependent on the material flow of goods across the globe since the 70s. And I think that the financial sector itself is, among other things, already in the 70s, the growth of a series of professions that sort of through actuarial science are also allowing for a viable space of trade to unfold at greater complexity, both cartographically and financially. But Trump won introducing his own financial structures to secure the trade of risky goods. Is in a way, it's sort of it's in a way analogous to the like the emergence of crypto, that which also like took off under Trump one. And the White House is now virtually nothing more than a bunch of sort of like extremely despotic, fine, completely fucking idiotic, but also powerful and in their own way rational crypto crony fascists. And so the fact that now the American military can be used as a way of securing the trade of risky goods and backing an insurance pledge, I think has to be treated in that context. The actual financial, the actual like insurance sector is like, they recognize the severe risk of this, and I think they're freaking out. And then every day they hear Trump saying, "No, no, no, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." And this is one of the things that you're really hearing in sort of financial editorials is this very paradoxical phenomena in which traders and insurance brokerages are saying, we need to these commodities are now extremely risky. It's very unlikely that they will be delivered at the price negotiated, and we don't have the capacity to, because we no longer have a kind of diplomatic relationship to Iran. We cannot guarantee the delivery of these goods. And then the same day, and so then the price starts to go up because the risks are accelerating and there's a lot of anxiety on Wall Street. And then the same day, of course, Trump will say, recognizing this phenomena, oh, it's going to be fine. We're going to amp up pressure. By the end of the week, the war will be over, et cetera. And then literally the same day, those prices will start to come back down again. And so that's what I mean by this sort of context of dual power is like, in really kind of comedic and also surrealist ways, like the reality of this situation told through the story of the price of oil is the reality is literally changing by the hour based on which of these kind of two traditional sectors of the American power structure, Wall Street, now the White House, which are now more or less distinct, who's saying what, when, on what platform. And I think that's a sign of deep rot, actually, at the heart of capitalism.
Yeah.
The voice in which the price and risk is being negotiated per hour, is changing the actual capacity of the economy to accommodate these realities. Then I think there's also another point here, which is like strategically from a socialist perspective, I don't think it's ever the right answer to say that these logistical spaces are nothing more than the worst version of capital writing the world in its own picture. I think it's actually the worst version of capital writing the world in its own image through the medium of labor. And so there's always these labor relations are everywhere you look in logistical spaces, sometimes often in the most dominated and exploitative forms, no doubt, but also therefore also the most risky. I'd say the real risk in the global economy told through the story of logistical spaces, especially in the energy sector and ocean-borne energy trade, are the forms of labor that do and do not comply. And so the other story that we're not really hearing a lot about right now are just the hundreds of, if not thousands of workers on these tankers and cargo ships who are stuck with no rights. Very similar to what we saw during COVID. And that is also risky for insurance brokerages, crypto fascists, and Wall Street alike. The non-compliant forms of labor, and I think that's a part of the story that we're not seeing told in the liberal media right now.
That's interesting, and I wonder if we can talk about it more here by thinking about like different kinds of commodities and the infrastructure. Like we hear infrastructure a lot now. We hear LNG infrastructure is crucial in these ways. We hear about farmers and how they can't access fertilizers. And we hear about helium if we're looking deeply, and how the helium shortage will be a problem for Silicon Valley, which requires them for semiconductors. 10 to 20% of the helium market is party balloons, so there will be knock-on effects in that very sort of form of niche labor, as it were. Like this is a logistical web that, as you say, has people in it, and it's important to remember the fact that there are people, compliant or non-compliant, that are stuck in these choke points as well. And the fact of food not being produced will mean people starve in a lot of places. That people can't get food, can't grow food. That there will be shortfalls that cause people hunger. And I was hoping we could chat about the fact that the flow of fertilizer is also like notably being halted by this war on Iran. The Strait of Hormuz has been called the world's busiest fertilizer corridor. Half of the global supply of urea, a nitrogen-based fertilizer, and almost a third of the ammonia supply run through the strait. And the heart of this problem is that like 4 billion people worldwide rely on food that is grown with synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, or fertilizers that are made by breaking down natural or fossil gas and taking the hydrogen out of it, combining that with nitrogen to make ammonia, and mixing it with CO2 to get urea. There's no reserve, apparently, for this complex cocktail that gives us most of our food. What do you feel like it means? Because beyond the visibility problem, right? Like if we want to drill a little bit deeper, as it were, and think about the labor and the table, right? The farm to table problem. Like what does it mean that we've reached this point where there's so many people worldwide, half of the people, that are desperately reliant on fossil fuels to create the kind of fertilizer that's necessary to feed us?
The the quick literacy with which many commentators, but also sort of just in common conversation, just thinking with people about what this is going to mean for the price of your basket of goods in 6 months. The amount of literacy we're getting around supply chains in the past 3 weeks is kind of amazing. The fact that we're just sort of having conversations casually about like how our food is grown and where the materials and required for that kind of biogeochemistry come from and how they get to where we get here, where I am in the Netherlands and Western Europe, which is one of the most highly mechanized, automated agricultural sectors in the world, which is largely dependent on nitrogen and phosphate-based fertilizers, which all of that stuff, it comes from somewhere in the earth. It is then made, refined, and assembled somewhere else. And it's true that I think, I've been paying close attention to one supply chain in the agricultural fertilizer trajectory that comes from the Western Sahara on the one hand and Israel on the other, both into the port of Amsterdam. And I do think that's actually part of this story is like there's in the Gulf region, there are a number of big players in the fertilizer market. And I think that's, the other kinds of players producing at scale industrial fertilizers for the African nations, for India, and indeed all the way up to China. I think that's a part of the supply chain that I know a little bit less of, but I know there's people doing really good work on that. And I know that Israel is quite threatened economically by the dominance of the Gulf producers in the fertilizer market, because they themselves, one of the largest state-owned Israeli companies, which has one of its headquarters in the port of Amsterdam, is also trying, is a producer of agricultural fertilizer. And if I'm not mistaken, the port out of which it is largely being shipped was bombed last week. So I think that's another part of the story as well, indeed, that, we're learning a lot of us really quickly about how the food we eat is actually a commodity. And as a commodity, it is the result of various supply chains and value chains that are sensitive and inextricably linked to the negotiation of international geopolitical power that is right now very aggressive and seeking to recreate the conditions of its own reproduction in ways that I don't think we've seen so blatantly in the past 30, 40 years. And it's doing so, I think, precisely because the amount of value that then is produced on the other end of these supply chains is not what it might have been in the 1970s or 60s. And so there's a kind of constraint generally on the amount of surplus value available in the market. And so all of a sudden, the grounds by which these supply chains secure the production of those values have to be renegotiated through fucking bombs and genocide. And so I do think the question of food and fertilizer it's linked in ways that are, really bizarre, but also perfectly normal within a world shaped by capital, which is unfortunately ours, which is to say it's linked in bizarre ways to the genocide in Palestine, to Israel's deep discomfort with its own relationship to its settler colonial power in the region, a region that is framed by the rise of the Gulf states, which more or less are politically compliant with the terms of Israel, but also economically are at odds, deeply at odds with Israel's power in the region. And so, there's a question about where these fertilizers are going to come from in 6 months if those stock feeds deplete. There's also questions about what happens to polities historically when the price of food becomes unaffordable. There's really, real, and you go to any political science department at any university, you'll know that one of the deepest fears of power is a hungry population. And so, those are all important questions sort of be thinking about, or risks that I think we should be sort of attentive to in the coming months, or, outputs or results of this imperial aggression that in 6 months we might be looking at. And I think then we should be saying, okay, we know that some of the causation is actually built already into this moment, and the rationale that makes bombing Iran reasonable from a certain perspective. My hope is that, as in any crisis, as the kind of literacy, which was already there, frankly, but as the literacy around how our food is made and the complexity of a global supply chain and the volatility built into those supply chains increases in the coming months, my hope is, of course, that people start to take care of one another, and the already existing vernaculars that we have in places all over the world with regards to growing food, sharing food, community-based agriculture, and forms of subsistence that do not depend on global industrial supply chains become much more reasonable, much more common, and that the social infrastructures that flow from that basic, as you say, kind of space of sociality, the social infrastructures around the sharing and growing of food, those social infrastructures get stronger. Because I don't know about you, but living in sort of Western European or North American, sort of middle class, mostly kind of white, capitalist societies for the past 20, 30 years, it's been sort of dog shit, actually, on the terms of like sociality and hopes for social infrastructures that can be robust enough to sort of, prevent the rise of fascism. It's not been very hopeful, but maybe this is exactly the kind of trigger that allows for us to look around and say, okay, well, those supply chains are not only based in settler colonial violence and displacement, but they're also not benefiting anybody on the tail end, except for the the private equity firms that own these infrastructures. What else could we do that maybe doesn't depend on such violence and exploitation?
Yeah, no. I think that's such an important set of points. This like opening onto an alternative, model is really crucial in this moment where like it would be understandable to slip totally into despair, and to imagine that there is no future other than capitalist self-immolation. It reminded me at the end there, what you were saying reminded me of the show Pluribus, which is sort of still in the zeitgeist. This Apple TV show where there's like this, virus that effectively makes all of humanity one consciousness. And it solves a lot of these ecological catastrophic ecological trajectories. There's a moment, though, where one of the people who are immune to that virus, that remain an individual, the kind of central character, walks into a grocery store that has been emptied out, and she's suddenly in this kind of crisis, right? Because she can't shop for food in this dog shit way that we've just like plasticine kind of way that we've become accustomed to, and forces the hive mind to like restock the grocery store so she can experience this like familiar ritual of picking out her food. And like that model makes no sense. And this nightmarish dystopian alternative that the show presents you with, um, immediately still is sensible enough, I guess, to recognize that that does not make any sense. It doesn't make sense to buy your berries in a small plastic container. But yeah, I mean, this kind of leads into. I mean, I don't want to take too much more of your time. We've covered a lot of ground. There's much, much more to cover, of course, but I think it might make sense to, tentatively close by thinking about this as a quote unquote demand destruction event. That's the
Hmm.
name that some economists have given for the trigger that you described. So this is something Paul Sankey said recently on this kind of manufactured crisis, that it could become a demand destruction event where he says everyone loses. And what he means is that these ripple effects are going to especially hit vulnerable countries, countries that are deeply dependent on liquefied natural gas, for example, and have been historically very opposed to like nuclear energy. This quote from Sankey was really striking to me. He says, "The market has been seeing the unprecedented closure of the strait as an aberration, whereas oil historians are viewing this as a structural change in the risk of oil." If this disruption can change how whole countries think, or people in these countries think about like energy, security, supply, it's still going to do so in ways that are, it feels like, inherently violent. And the system, you write, has always fed on these moments of material rupture, delay, breakage, accidental and intentional interruptions that are actively exploited, usually, to realize and extract value across the length of the supply chain. So, you know, I guess the last question is the hardest one, but it is the sort of most open-ended one. It is like about what futures we can perceive from this moment. Like, can it accelerate the clean energy transition? Will it mean a consolidation of power in places like Russia? Should we go nuclear? Right? Um, and where is the place of finance in either the forecasting of these futures or the foreclosing of these futures?
Hmm. Yeah, nice question. I think, we should all be sitting around our kitchen tables together, really thinking about this and coming up with strategies that make sense based on the indicators that we're seeing to take care of one another and also to, actually be building the kinds of worlds that we want because it is so self-evidently clear to everybody I speak to, both in universities and adjacent, that this is not the world that we want. And the world that is given to us is being actively destroyed, and the forms of very, very soft social legitimacy it had, if any at all, is now completely gone. Um, and I think the fact that there's so much to say, there's so many dimensions here that I think are difficult to like bracket to just answer that question. But I do think that, first of all, anytime you have a rapid increase in literacy around the basic determinations that shape social life under capitalism, that's a good thing. That's a good thing because it's counter to the basic terms of alienation. It also very, very provisionally, though as a necessary step, I think this has always has got to happen. It punctures the basic terms of commodity fetishism, even if provisionally. And something then has to be possible in the wake of those two things happening, which also are compounded by the fact that most commodities that we depend upon will become unaffordable potentially in the next 6 months or so. And then the fact that then we have basically like this multipolar world with different kinds of voices that are more or less metonyms of certain kinds of ideologies, but those ideologies are also sort of interchangeable. That is to say, they're not particularly promising in the futures that they're showing could be possible. Also, and are backed almost entirely by sort of like despotic tyrants who have virtually no social license on any metric, from Trump to Putin. I think that also has to be conditioning a possibility that the former liberal accord can no longer secure. I think questions of civil society behaving normatively according to certain kinds of principles that are, that are self-evident, that have due process backing them, that stem from a certain kind of tradition of political philosophy that begins and ends with the rationality of the market and the economic individual. That's all. Nobody believes in that shit anymore. I mean, some people will fight for it. Ezra Klein will fight for it. Sometimes it sounds hysterical. It sounds ridiculous. And I think that also is a good thing. There's a puncturing of a certain kind of veneer of, like post-war capitalism that has been dying for a long time. And the only people fighting to keep it alive are fucking pedophiles with an enormous amount of unearned wealth. They're the only people fighting for it. And then the Peter Thiels of the world who are talking about the end times and, the divinity of AI. It's like, fuck off. Nobody thinks that except for you, because you're the only ones who will benefit from that story. Nobody wants that world except the assholes who benefit from it economically. And I think that's clear. And, what we ought to be doing now to close that story, to remove them from power, to begin to build the social and political infrastructures that actually promise the kinds of universal care, the universal inclusion into a world building project that actually I think could be meaningful, can get people excited, can wake us from this disgusting sort of like brain rot slumber. That's the hard work that we have to be building, but it is happening, of course. I don't think the story being told by these despotic AI crypto crony assholes I don't think anybody's buying it. Unfortunately, to dethrone them, to remove the forms of power that they have built their enterprise on from the executive is going to be difficult and maybe at times illegal. But in the meantime, any moment when we have seen, quote unquote, robust, successful anti-fascist struggle, and we have seen that, we actually do have examples of that, successful anti-fascist liberation struggles. They have been successful in France, in Italy, even in Germany. They have been successful in Spain. They have been successful because of the forms of social infrastructures that allowed for a kind of deep care, a deep trust, a form of knowledge exchange, a form of sharing, the promise of some kind of liberation, a story of liberation that motivates people. And sometimes I look around and I think it's hard to identify where we might build that social infrastructure now. But at the same time, I mean, I'm just like a white guy, I'm like a white guy professor. Like my vocabulary around social infrastructures is inherently malnourished. I think it's everywhere around us, actually. And I think that, we have no choice but to build on those social infrastructures, resist these motherfuckers, build something that we want that actually benefits everybody, and get these guys out.
Yeah, I really appreciate you articulating with so much just like real anger. I think like, anger can be a gift in this moment where, we're being sold a bill of goods, we're being presented with futures that, as you've written, like few of us want anymore, right? This more and more and more, this endless pursuit of more feels incredibly hollow. And even, like eco-fascistic. There's no future for that. So yeah, really lovely to talk to you and to hear this kind of reverberating rage in this moment, honestly. I think we need more of it, to be honest. So thank you so much for speaking with me today.
My pleasure, and thank you as always for creating the space and the amazing work you do. And it really, a lot of people appreciate it. Keep it up.